So today we're going to be looking at Gail Gerhardt's interpretation and weighing it up against other arguments. So she argued that the mental revolution rendered state retaliation useless in 1970s South Africa. So what are the alternative arguments to that? So it is a fact that state retaliation became more or less useless in the 1970s, but was it just due to black consciousness? Was it just due to the actions of the children in Soweto which spread around the country? Or was it something else? What else would actually be important in trying to hold the government to account, in trying to reduce the power of the government? And it's to do with actually the South African workforce. So if we're thinking about the composition of the workforce in South Africa, and we're thinking about the importance of black African workers, we need to bear in mind that they were domestic servants, they were the majority of the miners in the country, 1.5 million of them were farm labourers, and they were manufacturing workers too. So if we're thinking about the monopoly that black African workers have on the South African economy, it's very, very vast. If black African workers stop working, South Africa's economy shuts down because they're working in the pillars of the economy. They're working in the most important sectors in South Africa's financial resources and financial richness. And if we're thinking about it, the conditions that these workers are working in are pretty horrific. Really, really poor standards, no basic health and safety. The replaceability of the workers in the mines meant they didn't bother to have proper health and safety regulation. It was an extremely dangerous job, for example, working in the mines. And even as we've seen with coronavirus, BME people are often just put in the front lines of these sectors, and very little is done to protect them. Even worse so in South Africa during apartheid. So in terms of pushing back against the state, it could be as simple as not working. However, if you're not going to work, if you're going to strike, it needs to be organised, which is crucial. Because if you just refuse to go to work, and let's say you get a few of your friends to do the same, they will just fire you and replace you with some other people who need to work. And if you're not working, you don't have basic necessities such as food, such as a roof over your head. So we're tied in this they're tied in this perpetual economic servitude, the fact that you need to work to live, but you're not being paid enough to work to live. So there is this interesting moment where if you keep denying these basic necessities to workers, they'll eventually push back, because although they have no alternative but to work, they'll have no alternative but to strike to guarantee better working conditions too. However, as we understand, apartheid was an extremely repressive government, and it had no sort of qualms in using repressive responses to people who were working and speaking out. So how important was labour conflict in renewing black protest? So Worden, a historian, wrote in 2012, said that black protest was renewed by labour conflict. So Worden's making this argument that it wasn't actually the mental revolution that made state retaliation useless. It was more so black protest. It was more so the actions of the workers. So just give you a few seconds to write that down. Okay, so why was it that the African trade union tradition died out in the 1960s? So South Africa actually always had quite a healthy trade union organisation, the trade union tradition. However, it died out in the 1960s. So the reason for that is the big umbrella group for the trade unions was the South African Congress of Trade Unions. And the issue for them in the 1960s is they were really heavily affiliated with the ANC. And when the ANC was banned in the 1960s under the Unlawful Organisation Act, they were also heavily suppressed too, because they were affiliated with that movement. And the cleverness of the Unlawful Organisations Act was that it didn't really define who the unlawful organisations were. Instead, it was actually an act which just looked to stifle any oppression and make it lawful to arrest people for being involved in even a trade union. However, there is a revival, there is a shift in the 1970s, and this begins with the Durban dock workers' strike of 1972. So this began with dock workers who brought the harbour to a standstill through a stop at 5 strike, which meant at 5 o'clock everybody puts down their tools and everybody stops working. And this was the dock workers who began this. However, the power of this strike was not that it was solely the dock workers, but that workers across different industries and different sectors united in the strike. This led to 100,000 people, which were half of the entire African workforce in Durban, going on strike. This lasted an entire month. So the workers were crying out for better wages, the removal of the humiliation through the pass laws, fighting against the hardship of migrant labourers and the denial of basic human rights. And what this did was dealt a mortal blow to the apartheid government and its white capitalist allies, due to the fact that this strike was so organised, and the consequences of the strike was this huge backlog of cargo. And it was important because there was that solidarity. Nobody was going to be what we would call a scab. Nobody was going to break the strike and take the cargo off of the ships. They said, no, we are all supporting the strike. So if there's nobody taking the cargo off the ships, and there's nobody trying to package that cargo and so forth, there is no chain of trade. There is no chain of kickstarting the economy or working around this. So the people who were crucial in getting in imports and taking out exports from South Africa, if they're refusing to be part of that chain of trade, then the trade breaks down because they are so integral. So thinking about the nature of apartheid, what's likely going to be the response to this? And actually, very, very interestingly, the response was that the wage board actually agreed to increase minimum wage by 40%. That's a huge increase. Not entirely fair, not entirely what they needed, still below what was necessary, but the fact that they made such a huge concession shows the power of this collective action and the power of a united African force. It's also really crucial because it marks a turning point in a struggle against non-segregated unions, being that collective action is most powerful when it's non-racial. This is because when you have racial movements and you have Indian workers fighting and you have coloured workers fighting and African workers fighting, what they end up doing is just undercutting each other. So the Indian workers will strike, but then the African workers will take the jobs that they refuse to do and so forth. So what happened here is it was a non-racial movement that created this change, and it ends the legislation which prevents non-racial movements. So it creates a more integrated worker strike. So workers are just united by the fact that they are in the same economic category rather than racial divisions, removing that undercutting through divide and rule. It's also a significant strike because it signalled the growth of militant non-racial trade unionism, evolving an alliance between workers and liberation movements. So what I want you to think about is there's a small text for you to read, Wanted a Living Wage, the Urban Strikes of 1973. And I want you to answer those two questions. So what caused the strikes in Durban and why were they successful? The other thing I want you to do is answer this third question. Were these economic or political reasons that caused the grievances? So to Gerhardt, she would be arguing it's the political reasons that's going through this idea of black consciousness. So was it this political awakening? Or was it more so just the bare bones economic reasons, the simple things of not having food in your belly that's causing people to strike like this? So what ends up happening then is you have the emergence of independent trade unions in the 70s and the 80s. And so you had in 1979 the Federation of South African Trade Unions formed. And this is quite crucial because it's about trying to get trade unions to work in unison. So the Federation of South African Trade Unions was an umbrella group which basically united the unions underneath it so that it's all coming towards a common aim. So you would have, for example, your metal union, you'd have your teachers union, you would have your canned good union, you would have your dockers union and packaging union and all sorts. And so they're separate unions, but they would all come together under this one umbrella union, so that they would all unite together. Because if you're thinking about the chains of trade and the chains of the economy and the chains of the labour force, instead of just having one break in the chain, you would bring apart the entire chain and unite as a collective workforce rather than individual jobs. So these trade union movements then, under this umbrella, worked in unison with liberation groups. So, for example, the Sweet Food and Allied Workers Union openly declared Charterism and recruited youths to join the MK. So there's a very strong link then to liberation movements. There's a very strong link to the wider issues in South Africa, rather than just about economics, rather than just about things like pay. So the revival of unionism then led to the rebirth of the ANC as a resistance movement, especially as unions saw greater success, such as the African Metal and Allied Workers Union and Canning Workers Union in 1979, who won a victory against an employer who was taking advantage of the canning workers' unions. So by coming together and fighting together, it led to actual success. Rather than just being separate workers fighting against big companies, it becomes big workers fighting against big companies and showing the real strength of collective action and the strengths of striking. And I'm feeling frustrated in this coronavirus situation right now, because if we're thinking about schools reopening, this is a fundamental issue because it's dangerous. It's dangerous to the children in our community, and it's dangerous to the members of staff who are working in those schools. However, it's also dangerous to the bus drivers, because these young people will be getting on the buses and overcrowding the buses, which is eventually going to hurt the bus drivers too. So those are two sectors that opening schools are going to be harmful to: the teachers and the bus drivers and the bus workers, as well as obviously the hospitals, because now they're going to be under more strain again. So instead of those three workforces coming together to say we're not supporting schools reopening, you have the teaching unions fighting for the teachers, you have the bus drivers fighting for the bus drivers, and you have the health unions fighting for the NHS staff. So why don't all three of them come together? And that's what we're missing here in the UK. This sort of umbrella organisation to say that it doesn't matter what job you do, what actually matters is that we're all fighting for equality, we're all fighting for justice, and we're all fighting for workers. And that's missing here today in the UK, but that's what we really see forming in South Africa in the 1970s and the 1980s. So Worden then offers his interpretation. So what I want you to do is read his interpretation and think about what is it that he's arguing sparked the uprisings in the 1970s, and how does it compare to Gerhardt's view, and what is it that they're disagreeing on really. So just have a careful read of that and see if you can work out what it is that he's arguing. If you're still not sure, then we will discuss this in the podcast, so you get to have a wider view and a wider understanding of that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to read another interpretation, which is by this gentleman here called Herson. And he writes a book called The Year of Fire and the Year of Ash, the Soweto School Children's Revolt that shook apartheid. And in it, he's essentially writing an analysis of what was it about this decade, what was it about the 70s that led to this Year of Fire and Year of Ash. And what was it that led to what Gerhardt's saying, state retaliation being useless? And you have two contrasting interpretations here. He's saying the strikes must be seen as constituting the beginning of the Soweto revolt. So the Soweto revolt happened because of the strikes, whereas Gerhardt's arguing of all the causes leading up to the June confrontation, Black consciousness was the most important in accounting for the determination and resilience of the youthful militants who spearheaded the anti-government demonstrations. So two contrasting arguments there. You have Hurston's interpretation that it was the strikes and it was economic factors that led to the rebellions and the revolts, whereas Gerhardt's arguing it was the political causes, it was the change in identity, and it was the change in the political identity of Black people in South Africa. So you're going to listen to a podcast which is going to break this down for you a little bit more and answer the questions on the homework doc. Any questions, please let me know.